A Hello Kitty lunchbox washes onto shore. A writer finds it. Inside is a diary written by a Japanese teenage girl, and the two form a relationship. And if you think about it, it's what happens to all of us when we read a really good book. We form a relationship with that particular book, and through the story, we also form a relationship with the author. So my plan was to go to the bookstore and buy Ruth Ozeki's new novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness. But since it was sold out, I decided to get her last book, A Tale for the Time Being. And her story took me on a wild journey of the diary written by the Japanese teenage girl that washes up on shore and is found by a Japanese-American writer. So I want to share with you 6 tips on writing from Ruth Ozeki that come from reading her novel, A Tale for the Time Being. These tips also come from reading interviews with the author on the internet. Tip number 1, break the fourth wall. I'm sure you've heard of the word the fourth wall. In acting, it means there's an imagined invisible wall that's separating the actors and the audience. And the actors are not supposed to directly talk to the audience unless they're in character. Usually in a novel, it works the same way. A writer is not supposed to talk directly to their reader. But in her novel, A Tale for the Time Being, Ruth Ozeki frequently breaks the fourth wall by talking directly to her reader. However, it works the way Ozeki does it because she has a Japanese teenager directly asking questions to the person who's going to become the reader of her diary. The girl's story in her diary and the questions she asks her future reader end up creating a relationship between the writer who finds a diary and the Japanese teenage girl. The girl says in the first couple pages that she's thinking about suicide, and this makes the reader of the diary feel a concern for her. Here's an example of how Ruth Ozeki talks directly to her reader. This is the first paragraph from her book. Hi, my name is Now, and I am a time being. Do you know what a time being is? Well, if you give me a moment, I will tell you. A time being is someone who lives in time, and that means you and me and every one of us who is or was or ever will be. Tip number 2, make yourself a character in your novel. Ruth Ozeki does something really interesting in her novel, A Tale for the Time Being. She puts herself in her novel with her same name, her same identity. She's a Japanese-American author. She also puts her husband, Oliver, as a character in her novel. I believe her cat is also a character in the novel. I like the way Ozeki is basically combining 2 different genres, memoir writing and fiction, by having herself as a character and her husband reading the diary written by the Japanese girl Now and thinking and reacting to it. And eventually Ruth, the character, begins to do internet research to see if Now and her family members are alive. It seems like it would be a memoir instead of a novel if you put yourself as a character in a novel. But it works the way Ozeki does it. She not only adds herself and her husband as characters into her fictional story, but she also adds the 2011 Japanese tsunami to kind of break into the fictional container of her story and to add some reality into the story of Now, the Japanese teenage girl. Tip number 3, alternate narrative voices. Ozeki's novel switches back and forth between 2 narrator voices. One is Now, the Japanese teenage girl who writes in her diary about her experience moving from the United States to Japan and all the bullying she goes through and her dad attempting suicide and her own suicidal feelings. And the other narrator voice is Ruth, the character, and her reading the diary and finding out what's going on in the girl's life and then eventually trying to find out if the girl and her family are alive. I think the alternating narrative voices work so well in Ozeki's story because she's trying to show the Buddhist concept of how we're all interrelated. This is evident not only in Ruth's relationship, Ruth the character, and Now the Japanese teenage girl, but it's also evident in many other characters in the novel. Tip number 4, write from the senses. In an interview. In an interview I read online with electricliterature.com, Ozeki shares one of her keys to narrative writing. She shares that she tries to enter into her writing through her senses by dropping back into her body and seeking to feel experiences as a character might. This reminds me of what Mary Karr says in The Art of Memoir. She says she goes back in time and tries to pick out an instance in time, and she keeps picking at that instance and picking at it and trying to be able to relive that experience, how she first experienced it, so she can write about it in a way that someone else can see it how she first saw it. I agree with Mary Karr that if you just keep picking at an instance in time, like you're picking at a knot, and you keep picking at it and picking at it, you're able to kind of go back in time and kind of see that experience through your five senses, and then you're able to write about it so someone else can kind of enter into your experience and kind of see it the way you saw it through your senses. Tip number 5, write with patience. Besides being a novelist and a Zen Buddhist priest, Ozeki is also a creative writing teacher at Smith College, and I like the writing advice she gives to her students about writing and patience. She says writers need to learn to be comfortable just sitting still, waiting, being silent, and this can be difficult for a lot of writers like myself who want to jump right in and start writing. I think there's times when I'm just kind of going and going and going in my writing. It's coming from my instincts, and that's really good. But I think what Ozeki's saying is sometimes it's really important to slow down and really just to kind of listen. And sometimes that muse will kind of speak to you and draw out some of your story that you wouldn't get if you were just kind of going too fast. So I'm trying to slow down in my writing to be able to close my eyes, and as Mary Karr says, to enter into my past experiences through my sentences. I'm also learning how to listen to my story, realizing really it's my story that wants to lead me more than me leading my story. Tip number 6, keep a writer's process journal. I like to read what other writers say about their own writing process, and one thing I picked up in an interview with Ruth Ozeki is she likes to keep a writer's process journal. The writer's journal is basically a place that she can go to write about any difficulties she's having with, say, the structure of her novel. She can just write down some of her thoughts about what's difficulties she's having and possible solutions to those difficulties. I started my own writer's process journal, and what I've noticed is it's a great place. You can write down things that are going really well for confirmation about what you like in your writing. You can also work out those problems that you're having with maybe the structure of your novel or your memoir, in my case. So there are 6 tips on writing from Ruth Ozeki, and I think the 2 tips that stood out to me and applied to most to my writing is going back in time to re-enter an experience to be able to write from your 5 senses. And then the second one is learning to write with more patience. And I think those two kind of go hand in hand, because if you're going to write about a past experience, you really do have to write with patience. You have to be able to kind of close your eyes and re-enter that experience to be able to write about it. As always, thank you for listening, and keep striving to improve in your own writing. I'm going to leave a little link here if you want to take a look at more of my writing.